Hello again, Veritas48. I'd like to start by saying that it was one of your videos that initially prompted me to begin posting videos on YouTube, so thanks for the new hobby. Like most of the atheists on here, I like your style. Firm, not vicious. And if it's true that a person can be judged by the strength of their enemies, or perhaps opponents would be the more appropriate term here, then you would seem to rate fairly highly as things go here on YouTube. I mean, I see that you're in dialogue with at least one working philosopher. Well done there. Where on earth did you find one? I'm kidding, I'm an aspiring philosopher myself. Anyway, I watched your video on what you've dubbed the normative argument, in which, if you'll permit me to summarize, you claim that a designer is the most reasonable explanation for the occurrence and the foundation of prescriptions, that is, for the occurrence and foundation of oughts. You observe what I believe was Hume's principle, dubbed the naturalistic fallacy, that you can't get an ought from an is, and you point out that this leaves a void when it comes to explaining oughts, a void you claim God fills. Dare I say God of the gaps? And while God might even serve as a hypothetical explanation, I still see no positive reason to accept his existence here. So, of course, this just offers him another place to stand. And, of course, one should hardly be surprised that the most reasonable explanation is God, when one merely defines God as the most reasonable explanation. What would be the most reasonable explanation for the force of moral prescriptions, you ask? Well, a thing which I shall call God, who merely bestows force on them because he wants to do so. To which I must ask, why not just call it X, then? So you mentioned the Dawkins Thunderfoot approach to the world and suggest a normative impotence on their part. The scientific accounting for the occurrence of ethics and prescriptions is merely an explanation of the phenomenon and, as you say, impotent to justify or lend weight to any prescriptions. But it doesn't end there, and it's not as though that's all naturalism has to say on the topic. If the emergence of ethics and morality has an evolutionary history or explanation, this doesn't mean that from a purely scientific standpoint prescriptions are hollow statements. This is merely an accounting of the enterprise's lowly origins. And this account may, and I submit does, point to the emergence of a thing which might be all that's required to lend weight to a prescription. We evaluate prescriptions not from a purely rational or scientific standpoint, as you suggested Dawkins or Thunderfoot might, but as rational as well as emotional beings, capable of empathy, fear, and greed, and capable of deducing what would satisfy our desire to see ourselves and others generally go unharmed. The very first thing listed on your profile is pathos, logos, veritas. Do you suspect that scientists deny the relationship of these three things? I mean, it's now a well-understood phenomenon that we have a natural and pressing desire to care for small cuddly things with large eye-to-head ratios that cry and seem defenseless, and we recoil at the sight of people acting contrary to that desire.
So I have to ask you, couldn't empathy, something common to most people, be a sufficient impetus for acting according to the dictates of a given prescription? Couldn't empathy be the germ of ethics? I submit to you that it can. I should point out that the policy, you can't get an ought from an is, doesn't mean that oughts are prescribed in a factual vacuum. Oughts aren't completely disjoined from facts. Oughts typically involve a number of ises, conjoined with a value of some kind. Prescriptions typically follow an is, value, ought pattern, unless I'm mistaken on some fine point here. A prescription stated explicitly would probably read along these lines. It is the case that choosing X will produce Y, and not choosing X will prevent Y. We value Y, therefore we ought to choose X. So ultimately I might have to disagree. If it is the case that you value Y, then X is what you ought to choose. If it is not the case, however, it seems there is no preferred course of action for you, and that the ought another person might prescribe is meaningless for you.
And this explanation plays nicely with a whole slew of facts, like the fact that sociopaths are unmoved by such prescriptions, and incidentally display no sense of empathy, or the fact that group pressures can override empathy just as they can override every emotion. Just as severe military training can override the natural fear of death, so too can it override a natural revulsion for taking a life. Just as fair-minded reasoning permits the imprisonment of criminals without generating remorse, so too can dogmatism overrule the natural inclination not to harm another unprovoked. This fairly plastic explanation for what is at the root of an ought explains not just why people behave morally, but it also predicts the occurrence of those who are unmoved by prescriptions and by what mechanisms they might arise.
It would also address all sorts of other oughts, like the more mundane things we might think are separate from ethics. You ought to not go to the top floor because you're afraid of heights. This ought still makes sense in spite of the fact that God is trivial. A person can be afraid of heights or not be, whether or not God exists. And even more interesting is the fact that prescriptions can be listed that actually run contrary to our moral sense and yet still make sense. To a person who is no respecter of property, the statement, "You ought to steal money if you want it," isn't ludicrous. The absence of a value for property and the presence of a value for one's own interests permits a prescription like this to be made, objectionable though it may be to people like you and me. You see, the explanation you give in the answer, God provided for it, treats most values as merely incidental, trivial, And I have to ask, if God has bestowed on us some germ of divinity which permits us to speak prescriptively, then what the hell happened to the Aztecs, who daily broke open the rib cages of the living and set alight their beating hearts? What afforded them authority to speak prescriptively about such heinous behavior? I'd be interested to hear how your accounting for oughts addresses these types of things. And of course, authoritative prescriptions still follow the same is, value, ought pattern. But the value involved is switched from concern for our fellow man, our children, our environment, or the suffering of a helpless animal, and is instead replaced with the value God commands it. It is the case that choosing X will produce Y, and not choosing X will prevent Y. God commands that we act always to produce Y, therefore we ought to choose X. But here's an interesting question. Why ought a person act according to God's commands? You might rebut, well, why ought a person act according to the dictates of values and emotions? But to ask a person to act according to their own empathy, for example, requires no appeal to any one or thing beyond their own faculties. If they lack empathy, then we can't really deal with them as a conventional participant in the social enterprise, and we have to accept that their lack of empathy renders our prescriptions basically meaningless for them. No amount of persuasion is likely to make our prescription meaningful again for them. I mean, how do you get through to a person to behave empathetically who doesn't speak that particular language? Now, a person might see a problem here, and there is one. But it isn't a problem for the explanation I'm providing. It's a problem for an ordered society. And the fact that this problem is actually reflected in the society around us only helps to support my explanation, I think. So if they possess empathy, however, the answer is simply something like a pre-rational desire for wish fulfillment. Clearly, the desire to see one's pre-rational drive satiated is sufficient to compel a person to act a certain way. And if it truly is pre-rational, and I think such things are, I think we found the root of the force behind an ought, and again, why it would have no force for certain people. Now, the same type of answer cannot be applied to the question, why ought a person act according to the dictates of God? One could answer, if a person believes in God, they must satisfy his demands in order to get into heaven, or something like that, in which case the answer is just wish fulfillment again. But a belief in God isn't pre-rational. One still needs a positive reason to believe in him first. So it seems to me that God is no better an explanation than empathy. As such, this question of normativity seems to be a moot point within the God debate, since normativity is explicable in other ways, and no more suggests God than it suggests anything else. Again, though, since a belief in God is not pre-rational, I think one must go elsewhere to first establish God's existence before you can come back and claim that God, as an explanation of normativity, is even on equal footing with naturalist explanations. Since, in my opinion, there is no alternative reason sufficient to support a belief in God, I have to conclude that God is not the most reasonable foundation upon which to base prescriptions. If you can tell me why I'm wrong, I would be interested to hear why. This is the Godless Heathen, signing off.